Here's what Suella Braverman has to say about the Coutts scandal. She says it exposes the sinister nature of much of the diversity, equity and inclusion industry. I presume she means equality. Apparently anyone who wants to control our borders and stop the boats can be branded xenophobic and have their bank account closed in the name of inclusivity. NatWest and other corporates who have naively adopted this politically biased dogma need a major rethink. This is also an issue for the public sector too, which is why I'm reviewing our policies at the Home Office. Well, that's good news, isn't it? It's good to know, because the trouble is an awful lot of this stuff starts in civil service offices, because we know, for example, in an awful lot of government departments, they want to know what your pronoun is. They sign off emails with pronouns. They make sure that the diversity and inclusion brigade are all over every single department, having seminars and sending people off on work details and making sure that quotas are met and all of that nonsense. And it's destroying the country's fabric. It's destroying the way that we live. It's destroying the way that people operate around each other. It's destroying the way companies are run. It's absolutely and utterly ridiculous. It's costing us an absolute fortune as well. Let's talk to Annabel Denham, Deputy Comment Editor, of course, at The Telegraph. Great story again from your newspaper this morning, Annabel. Nigel Farage obviously choosing you guys to vent his spleen, quite rightly. An extraordinary state of affairs. Let's hope that it becomes something of an isolated incident.
Well, yes, except I fear that it's not, and it's actually happening to a lot of people who don't have the wealth or resources of Nigel Farage to sound the alarm and raise awareness of it. You know, who knows the extent of this, who it's affecting, and whether they will feel as though they're able to speak up. But no, it's an absolutely extraordinary development in this story. We were led to believe that perhaps there was a funding issue, and that was why Nigel Farage was being expelled as a client of the bank Coutts. But no, it turns out that when the Wealth Reputational Risk Committee at the bank met in November last year, its members had pulled together a dossier on Nigel Farage that was nearly 40 pages long, and the justifications that were used for exiting him as a customer included things like his friendship with Novak Djokovic. And
I mean, that's the most extraordinary, probably the most extraordinary bit of it, isn't it? I mean, what's wrong with being friends with Novak Djokovic?
Well, I think it's part of the anti-vax stuff, and the fact that he was refusing to take the vaccine in order to participate. I think it was in the Australian Open in Melbourne.
Yeah, but does that make him, having made a free decision not to have a vaccination that he didn't want to have because he felt that it might affect his sporting abilities, that somehow that makes him an evil individual worthy of, you know, living on the Death Star with Darth Vader? I mean, it's ludicrous.
I completely agree with it. It is ludicrous. It was also his friendship with Donald Trump, and of course his opposition to net zero. The
democratically elected president of the United States of America.
Yes, absolutely. In contrast to the undemocratic net zero target by 2050 that, you know, people have not been able to vote for. Let's not forget that the main parties at the last general election were all firmly in favour of it. There was no opportunity for voters to make any kind of protest against a measure that is going to be cripplingly expensive, completely transform our economy, and, you know, ultimately risks impoverishing us all. So, you know, there's a real contrast there. It was also his criticisms of the King, and I think he said on GB News last night that Brexit had been mentioned maybe 50 times. In the dossier. So no, it's really clear that the powers that be at Coutts Bank seem to think that he was an unsavoury character who didn't hold the right views, whose views were perhaps bigoted, and that was grounds for them to expel him.
I mean, it beggars belief really that we're even having this conversation, it seems to me, but you're right. I mean, will there be, do you think, some kind of government guidance given out on this? Because some lawyers seem to believe that it's covered by the Equalities Act, that you can't discriminate against individuals on political grounds, but the sort of the grey area seems to be that political beliefs aren't necessarily a protected characteristic.
No, and it's extremely murky, I think. I mean, we've had instances of people who have been sacked from their jobs based on their religious beliefs, but because they were found to be perhaps discriminating against others within the workplace, their discrimination claims have not been upheld by employment tribunals. So, you know, it's essentially when one marginalised group butts up against another marginalised group, you know, who comes higher in the pyramid, the intersectional pyramid of victimhood that we now have in modern day British society. But of course, there's a real issue here, which is that if you cannot hold a bank account, it's extremely difficult to participate in society. It's very difficult to participate in the economy. It's difficult to get a job. You know, you are almost a non-person. I think it throws up the issue of financial inclusion, which warrants more attention from our political elite, and how we're going to ensure that people who don't have access to a bank account, people who hold their money in cash at home, are able to participate in an increasingly cashless society, and whether, you know, we are going to have to move towards a situation where banking access or banking is viewed as some kind of utility, and that people almost have a right to it, as they do in some European nations.
Yeah, exactly. But kind of encouraging words from Suella Braverman there, not just about Coutts, but also about addressing this kind of diversity and inclusivity doctrine inside of the civil service, because, you know, it must be terribly tedious to have to work in a place where everything has to be done through some kind of prism of diversity and inclusion.
No, I think that's right. And it's that the use of that word equity now, which seems to have replaced equality. It's not enough for us to live in.
Yeah, I thought that was a typo. So it was equity then?
Yes, this equity is the new equality among the...
I thought equity was something you had in a house.
Well, there's that too. But no, you know, this is all about ensuring equality of outcomes rather than the Conservative principle, at the moment at least, of equality of opportunity. Right. And it's much more heavy-handed, interventionist way of trying to ensure that ultimately, you know, people, we move towards a socialist society where everybody's earning the same and doing the same jobs, and, you know, how wonderful that would be.
Yeah, but, I mean, I don't know anyone that wants that. I mean, any people that want that are the people that don't work, basically.
Well, I mean, you know, we had yesterday the news that civil servants are now retiring an average of 62. So that's certainly a few years younger than people perhaps working in the private sector. And there are big questions to be asked around civil service productivity, the fact that departments are sitting empty half of the week because staff are still working from home years after we opened after the lockdown. So, you know, the whole thing needs to be revised. That massive increase in the number of civil servants, I think it was about 99,000 since before the pandemic. What are all of these people doing now that Brexit has been done, now that the pandemic is behind us? You know, there's so many questions to ask about machinery of government and what the output is there, but politicians ultimately seem too timid to you know, really take it on ever since Jacob Rees-Mogg ceased to be our business secretary.
Yeah. I mean, maybe the answer is actually to retire them even earlier and just not replace them, just get rid of them and go, thanks very much indeed, we'll see you later. Because you're right, you know, all of the people that got hired for COVID are not surely necessary anymore.
No, and the people, of course, who got hired for Brexit as well. There was a massive influx of staff into the civil service in order to negotiate and review and, you know, come up with proposals for what, you know, kind of Brexit deal the country might want. As far as I'm aware, many of those people are still remain in those jobs. No, you could argue that they should retire earlier. I perhaps would rather than retire, they go into the private sector, into the wealth creating side of the economy and make a contribution perhaps that way. You know, I don't want to be too dismissive of the civil service. Of course, there are a number of people there who work extremely hard and help ensure that our country is functioning. But it remains the case that at the moment, the government is pulling levers and nothing is happening. There is such a disconnect now between what ministers and secretaries of state are trying to drive through and what is actually happening at the ground level in the civil service. And that's, you know, that is a massive problem.
But it's like the NHS, isn't it? It's like any sort of government department. There's too many people. There may well be many who do a good job, but there's an awful lot who don't do very much. And you know as well as I do, Annabel, you work for a private company in the commercial sector. You know, you're held to account for various reasons and various jobs that you're supposed to do by the end of, you know, the week or by the end of the month or whatever it is that the deadline is. But in civil service terms, an awful lot of people don't really have a deadline. I mean, in only the civil service could you be given a task and be told, you know, can you come back to us in about 2 years?
Well, that's right. I mean, the incentives are all wrong, and that's why people like you and I, Mike, are in favour of as small a government as possible. The bigger it gets, the less productive it can be, the more of these superfluous jobs like diversity and inclusion managers seem to appear, often on very high salaries, and there isn't sufficient transparency and there isn't sufficient accountability, at least to the taxpayers who are paying their wages and for those government departments to be running. And, you know, there's the amount of government waste that we now have is absolutely enormous. Government spending as a proportion of GDP just keeps going up and up, and there doesn't seem to be any appetite among senior ministers to really reduce that significantly. And it's not just government spending, but it's also government consumption and the way that squeezes out, crowds out the private sector. The more that resources that are being absorbed and being used up by the government, the fewer resources there are, and the more the private sector is having to compete for them. And this is, completely off balance. So we need a fundamental rethink. And that's what Liz Truss was ultimately trying to do. And there were so many missteps, not least the fact that she lowered taxes before she tried to address supply side reforms. But that doesn't mean that we still don't need to reduce the size of the state, have a serious rethink about whether it needs to be involved in certain areas of policy. And I know I've talked to you about this before, but things like culture and sport and childcare, all of these sorts of areas, the government's tentacles are just absolutely everywhere in the British economy, and that is limiting the room for manoeuvre for ordinary men and women and businesses. It's making it more difficult for entrepreneurs to set up companies, for those companies to take on staff, and at some point I fear there is going to be a reckoning. At the moment, we've got high levels of employment, low levels of unemployment, but there's only so much that the wealth creating side of our economy is going to be able to take before we do start to see mass layoffs.
Right, exactly right.